Good morning. You can be seated. Man, we have such a blessing to have kind of worship team that we have here at Life Point. If you don't know me, I'm Coach Cody, I guess is what I get called here. It's not what I get called at school, but I'm the head basketball coach at Victoria West. So sometimes I sub in for less. I help with our students. Sometimes it's unexpected, sometimes it's not. This time is expected. One of my most annoying traits, some people have heard me say this before, is for my wife would tell you this, is my inability to focus. I tend to bounce around a lot, and I really have trouble focusing on something for an extended amount of time. You can see that from the string of almost completed projects I have at my house. And cleaning the garage is probably the worst. Like this last week I was cleaning out my garage, and this is the way my cleaning garage, I don't know how yours goes, but when I start cleaning out my garage, I start to pull things out of my garage. As I'm pulling things out of my garage, I realize that my lawn equipment is there, and I'll see the tree trimmers, and I'll see the tree in the front lawn. I'll realize that I need to trim the tree, so I'll start to trim the tree, right? And as I trim the tree, I'll see the hole that's in the front lawn, and I'll go and I'll get dirt from the back. And as I'm in the back, I'll realize that I haven't finished something there, and so on and so forth. And then it's dark, and all my stuff is in my driveway from cleaning out my garage, and I haven't completed it. I lack focus, so I don't get things accomplished all the time. Anybody else have that problem? Wives are raising their hands. Focus is a funny thing. I know people probably heard this. I've read this before. NASCAR and Formula One drivers are taught never to look at the wall, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but I always hear that in like leadership stuff. Because as soon as they look at the wall, that's where they go, right? Their focus is where they go. Their focus is what drives them. This quote's often used in business to talk about vision or focus that will lead to success. But I wonder if where this analogy is really needed is within our families. I've heard of focus on the family, but my question today is going to be, what are our families focusing on? In the Old Testament, God's people, the family of Abraham, often flip back and forth from laser focus to me cleaning out my garage, right? It actually becomes a cycle. Delivered out of Egypt, right? Following Moses, and then what do they end up doing? Wandering in the desert. Led into the promised land, right? And they come in, they win all these battles, and then where they end up? They end up forgetting who brought them there. And I think we can look back at their experiences and learn from both their seasons of focus and their seasons of lack of focus. And there's this really interesting book right after the Hebrew people get into the promised land with Joshua, and they conquer, and they're living the land of milk and honey, called Judges. And Judges is exactly what I'm talking about. It's this flip of back and forth, back and forth. The people will fall out of line with what God wants. Their focus will start on other gods, Baals or Asheroth, and they abandon what they believed. And then all of a sudden a judge is raised up, and they listen to this judge, and when they abandon it, they often get conquered by Canaanites, right? And they lived in captivity. And then the judge gets raised up, and everything gets back in line. They get focused, and then some miracle happens, and they conquer the Canaanites, and they're able to get away. And then 20 years, 30 years go by, and they lose focus again, right? And they end up in this continual cycle in Judges. It has some really cool stories. And at the beginning of Judges 2:11-13, it kind of describes this. It says, consequently, this new generation served the gods of Canaan, the Baals as they were called, doing what the eternal God considered evil. They abandoned the eternal one, the true God of their ancestors, who brought them safely out of Egypt, and instead they began to serve the gods of their neighbors, the Canaanites, bowing low before their images, causing the eternal to burn with anger. And worshiping random gods in statue form seems so distant from us, but honestly, what we're seeing here is God's people are forgetting who He is and what He has done for them. They're being distracted and losing focus on what God is wanting them to accomplish. As a people, as a family, they are forgetting that their purpose is to bless all people. That's the promise that's given to Abraham, that there'll be a blessing to all people. Their focus is turned to the shiny new things around them, and their priorities get out of line. We might not worship cows, but we do fall into the trap of worshiping things other than the one true God. We could think about that as success, whether that's our job or wealth or clout or looking for things other than God to bring us pleasure. That's what idolatry actually is. It's looking to something other than God to bring you pleasure. Sometimes these places have the potential to be idols, are hard to find, but I would question, if I was going to question what am I worshiping, I would ask things like this: where am I spending my time? What are we spending our time consumed with or thinking about? That tends to be what we're worshiping. And in our families, I think it's easy for us to start prioritizing things, even good things, and getting our focus out of line with what God wants. As a coach, I'm able to kind of observe from the outside. I was able to observe from the outside a long time about how people approach sports, right? And then I was in VYSO soccer this year, right? And I realized how time-consuming it actually can be, right? And it's a good thing, and I'm not saying not to be a part of those things, but when our children's happiness or our children's extracurricular becomes the central focus of our family, we lose perspective and focus of what God is really wanting from us. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. That's just an example. But are we focused on the correct thing as a family? I find that it's easy for my life to be a lot like me cleaning out the garage and kind of lack true focus and vision. To protect me from losing focus, my wife does something that's very helpful. She gives me a list. Right? It's helpful. I never knew lists exist until I met my wife. In the first couple years, I was very frustrated. I'm like, why do we have to write this stuff down? Then I realized I got stuff done. Right? In Deuteronomy 6:4-9, God gives a list to his people to help them stay focused. And he does this in the context of the family. Les read this a couple of weeks ago. It's the Shema, and Moses tells Israel this: "Listen, Israel, the Eternal is our true God, He alone. You should love Him and your true God with all your heart and soul and with every ounce of your strength. Make these things I'm commanding you today part of who you are. Allow them to be internalized by you." And he says to do that, repeat them to your children. He does this in the context of the family. Talk about them when you're sitting together in your home and when you're walking together down the road. I see this picture of family, right? Talk about them when you're sitting just make them the last thing you talk about before you go to bed and the first thing that you talk about the next morning. Do whatever it takes to remember them. Tie them as a reminder on your hand and bind them as a reminder on your forehead, where you'll see it all the time, such as on the doorpost where you cross the threshold or on the city gate. And so they took this very literally at times, and they put the Shema right above the threshold of a door so that when you walked out, you remembered. It was a constant reminder, as a checklist. What am I focused on? And he uses the family as the central place where this focus is meant to be kept, because he knows we were meant to do this faith thing in community. It wasn't meant to live alone. It wasn't meant for us to live our faith out alone. We were meant to live it in community in some way. So as husbands and wives and parents and grandparents and siblings, we are called to lead our families in being focused on God's purpose. So the question to me was this: how do we respond when we have lost focus as a family? And as I started to think as a coach, when I've lost focus, what is it my job to do? As a head coach, when we lose focus as a team, it's my job to lead. It's my job to reestablish that vision and focus. And so we have to start to ask ourselves, what does Christian leadership look like? And what does it look like within our family? And how can we apply it to our home? And so I told you, Judges is this, I know it's bouncing. It's driving me crazy. I'm sorry if it's not driving you. It's because my head is big. And so we, see, there it is. So we start, I'm going to have to go back to my notes. I have no idea where I am. So in Judges, I told you, we have this time where they have focus and they don't, and they have focus and they don't. And what creates focus are the judges. They are the leaders. That's who creates focus for them. And we have this great story in Judges 4 and 5 of this leader, this judge named Deborah. And Deborah's really intriguing to me because in most of the stories of leaders in the Old Testament, we find character flaws, right? Which is really helpful for me. I'm like, oh, no, they're not perfect either, right? But in Deborah, we never find a character flaw. And it's a phenomenal thing because at this time, women are not valued, right? It's a really crazy thing to think that she is included as probably one of the best leaders that we see in the Old Testament. And I'll kind of get into that later, but it's the system of value at this time is not what it is today for women. And so it's an unexpected leader in itself. And her story's awesome. But it's going to be really interesting because at the end, it turns into kind of like a slasher film, which I think is kind of inappropriate for family night. But you know, I'm the youth pastor. So what we find in Judges 4 and 5 is that Israel has lost its focus, and God has responded by allowing the Canaanites to conquer. And the Canaanite commander is this guy named Sisera. And he has a technologically advanced army of 900 ironclad chariots. And these 900 ironclad chariots have given him a technological advantage to conquer anyone around. No one has this kind of technology, military technology. And so he has completely taken over, and for 20 years, the Israelites are oppressed. And then during this time, we're told about Deborah. In chapter 4, Judges 4, verse 4, we read this. At that time, Deborah the prophetess, wife of, I'm not even going to try, Lapidoth, served as judge over Israel. She used to sit beneath the palm tree of Deborah, situated in the hill country of Ephraim, between Ramah and Bethel. And the people would go up to her to settle disputes. So she was this judge, and while judges tended to be military leaders of some sort, at the beginning she was just an actual judge. She just had the wisdom and leadership for the people of Israel to come, and she would settle their disputes, kind of like Judge Judy or something. I don't know, right? But she urgently sent for Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali. And Barak, what we're going to find, Barak is the leader of the Israelite army. So she brings the leader of the army, and she says this to him: the eternal God of Israel commands you, go and get into position near Mount Tabor. Take 10,000 soldiers from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, Jabin's general, to meet you at the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his army, and I will deliver him to you. Deborah calls on the leader of Israel's army and tells him it's time to follow God to Mount Tabor, for he is going to win a battle for you. It's interesting. It's not that you need to go lead, it's that you need to follow God. That's what he tells this leader. And I heard this. I'm lucky enough to have a daughter who's far better than I am, and I was talking about what I was going to preach on this passage, and she goes, you should go listen to this sermon by a pastor from a church we went to named Erica Graham. And as I listened to the sermon, I was like, oh, I'm stealing a bunch of quotes from her. So as a teacher, you're supposed to steal. That's what we were always taught. I know that's not what you're taught in real life, but one of the things that she said in her sermon is this: as Christians, we believe the ultimate way to lead is to follow. As we start talking about Christian leadership within our family, I think we have to be aware that the way that we lead is to follow. This makes sense. You think about what Christ said. He said, follow after me. and I will make you fishers of men, right? He said, take up your cross and follow me. It kind of seems counterintuitive, like you lead by following, but it's definitely what we have been taught. But sometimes we lose focus on that. As a kid, I was forced to run cross country. It's the only way you got to play basketball. And we ran cross country at 5 in the morning in Corpus Christi, Texas. And the way that we ran was my coach got on a bike with a flashing light and he drove. He never told you where you were going. He never told you how long the run was going to be. Sometimes we would run 5 miles. Sometimes we would run 12 miles. You just followed the blinking light, right? And as he rode on this bike, what would happen is everybody who played basketball had to run, so there'd be a group of like 50 of us out there. And as he drove, we didn't all stay together, right? And so you followed him, but there's a good chance that I was following just some guy who might see the guy who might see the light, right? And if anybody ever lost the light, we were in trouble, right? And he wasn't going to make up excuses for us. Like when we showed up to school at 10 o'clock, he was going to be like, oh, they got lost, you know? See, if any one of us ever lost focus of what was in front of us, if we ever forgot to follow, then we could never lead. And it's just a picture of what true Christian leadership looks like. We see this with kids all the time. Kids are constantly following us. I have a habit of using a word for poop that starts with CR, and someone heard me say it today. My daughter, Madeline, when she was about 5 years old, we were in a car to drive through at Wendy's, and I dropped something. I couldn't find something, and I said poop. Not the real bad word, just the, but I said poop. And then all of a sudden she said from the back, so she was younger than that. She was probably 2 or 3. She kept saying poop, 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 poop. She wasn't saying poop. And my wife looked at me and she goes, when she goes to school and she says that, it's calls coming to you, right? She was just following what I was. She was just following my lead. Where are we leading our kids? As a teacher, I'm able to see this all the time. There's some kids I have, I'm like, man, these kids are phenomenal. And it's not always true, but a lot of times then I run into their parents and I'm like, oh, right? Or I have a kid who will cuss me out. I'm like, where did you think that was okay? And then I'll call their parent to tell them to cuss me out, and they will cuss me out. I'm like, oh. Now, I at times will be in my house, and I'll kind of get frustrated because, just like always, like, my family will get upset. Tensions will get high. We all tend to be really hard-headed. And I'll be like, why are y'all yelling? And I start to think back about how I had been responding in the last, 5-10 minutes. And I'm like, oh, it's because of me. As leaders, we have to make sure we're following the right thing. If we're not following after what God would want from us continually, then our families are probably following in that same direction. That's a challenge. I think we have to ask ourselves, are we taking the time to ask God and reflect on what it means to follow after Him as a family? Are we taking time to search for what God is wanting to use and change our family? How God is wanting to use and change our family? And if we know that our family, if we know we are leading families, can we answer the question, where are we leading them to? Are we framing our family's purpose in something other than God's purpose? Or are we even thinking about framing it at all? The second thing that I come across in this story is Deborah and Barak, who's the leader of the army, have tremendous humility. There's this really interesting conversation between Deborah and Barak, the leader of the Israelite army, and it starts in verse 8. Deborah has just told him he needs to go to Mount Tabor, that they're going to fight, and he says, I will do this if you will go with me. but if you won't, then I won't go either. Deborah says, I will go with you, but you should know from the beginning that this battle will not lead to your personal glory. The Eternal has decreed that the mighty Sisera will be defeated by a woman. Then Deborah got up and accompanied Barak to Kadesh, and Barak summoned the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and they sent 10,000 men to follow him. With Deborah, they went to Kadesh. Anybody a fan of Seinfeld here? Right. If you've ever seen Seinfeld, there's a scene with George where George is at a party and there's a fire. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And he yells fire, and then he runs over an elderly lady on a walker, a clown, and like 4 kids on the way out the door, right? And it's funny because we think, well, he's cowardly, right? He's cowardly. What are we supposed to? What is supposed to? Let's get the women and children out first, right? That's like the Titanic rule or something. I don't know. But what's interesting here is this major military leader says, "Hey, I'm not going unless this female leader goes with me." And it's once again, like we get into I don't want to get really into the women's place in this day, but in the Old Testament at this time, most women had 2 purposes. That was to reproduce and to hold the house down, right? And so asking her to come on this journey with me into battle was about like George Costanza running over the lady on the way out, right? It was seen as cowardly. But I as I started looking at this, and then we actually taught on this last week in our youth group, and I started thinking, maybe what we see here is an act of true humility by Barak. He understands how good of a leader, and he values Deborah as a leader because she has consistently led the people of Israel. She has become someone that is trustworthy. And what he sees is that I need you. There's a level of humility in that, especially after she says, hey, this victory, this glory will not be yours. And he's like, oh, it doesn't matter. At the same time, I think there's a considerable amount of humility by Deborah, because Deborah doesn't just take over. She brings him with. They go together. There's a collaborative leadership that takes place here. There's a collaborative leadership that takes place here that is a kind of true humility where it doesn't matter who's in charge. What it matters is that we together lead the people of Israel out of captivity. I found it, I bring this up for this reason. I found it really interesting. I loved watching Les and Tisa up here preaching together about family. And I think at times we have to realize that family is meant to be done collaboratively. Leadership in the family is meant to be done together. And it takes true humility. It takes time to be able to step back and say, listen to our spouse, listen to our significant other, and go, they're the one that's right now. I need them. Right? We live in a world that doesn't like to look for help. And in this place right here, Deborah and Barak both are willing to take the help of someone else. Are we willing to look for help when we need it in our family? Because that's an act of true leadership. From our spouse, maybe from our small group. Maybe we're going through things, and what we really need is a grounded Christian couple who can invest in us. And I think that what we find here in this story is this place where we realize that true leadership, true Christian leadership at times takes the humility of being willing to ask for help. Leadership in today's society does not normally take this view. It's usually drenched with pride and self-conceit. This type of pride, the type of leadership that is pride, can be disastrous for a family, and many of us have probably seen that before. When one family member is more concerned with their success or authority than sacrificial love for the others, it tends to lead to bad things. Many people tend to want to lead from authority, but leadership is not the same thing as authority. I'll say that again. Leadership is not the same thing as authority. When I heard, that's another quote from Erica Graham, when I heard that, it kind of hit me, just thumped me. There's times in my family I try to lead through authority. And there is times for authority as a dad, right? Stop doing that. Why? Because, right? But if my only sense of leadership is from authority, then I'm really not leading. When my only sense of leadership as a basketball coach is from authority, if it's only from fear, what I realized a long time ago is my players might do what I want sometimes, but they won't do it with everything in them. Are we leading our families just through authority? She came after this, Erica Graham, and she defined leadership like this, and I thought this was phenomenal. She said, leadership is not a title you have, but something you do. It's mobilizing people to do difficult work, to face a difficult thing, to create positive change. It's mobilizing people to do difficult work, to face a difficult thing, to create positive change. Are we being intentional about mobilizing our family to do great things? It's a book called Good to Great that a coach had me read as I worked for him. And there's a lot of things it says in there, but one of the things it says greatness is not a function of circumstance. Greatness turns out is largely a matter of conscious choice and discipline. Within the leadership of our family, are we making conscious choices to choose the direction in which we are heading, or are we just surviving? I can tell you, with 4 kids at home, a lot of times it feels like we're just trying to survive. But I'm not sure if I'm creating the intentionality to say, what am I doing to lead my family to growing closer to God and to serving God together? And when we do that, then we know that we are consistently focusing on something. See, I think that we at times strategize and plan for our next big project at work or our next big project at home, but have we taken the time to strategize and plan how our family will live in God's will or find places to serve out God's purpose? What is your plan in the next week or month or year to grow your family in God? Are we taking the intentionality to do that? See, Deborah and Brock, they have leadership, but their leadership mobilizes the troops, and the troops go, right? Where are we going? Because if we're not being intentional in that, if we're not leading intentionally in that, I'll just tell you, someone is leading. I was also taught as a coach, if I'm not leading my team, someone else is, right? Are we being intentional about where the direction and the focus that we're taking our family to? The last thing that we kind of come across is the way that in this idea of leadership with the family is when we focus on the correct things, when we're headed in the correct direction, when we know that that's the way the leadership is going to take place, we have to also realize we don't fight our own battles. We just have to show up. Deborah tells Brock, we're going to go to Mount Tabor. And when we get to Mount Tabor, God's going to give the Canaanites over to us. So what they do is they go to Mount Tabor. It's on a mountain, right? And remember what I told you, Sisera, his armies are all chariots, iron chariots, heavy chariots, going up a mountain. And all of a sudden, you read in Deborah's song in chapter 5, it starts to pour, right? It's not like God just struck them down. It starts to pour. So when they showed up, it starts to pour rain, and these heavy chariots probably, it doesn't say this, but we can start to think what happens when heavy chariots get into mud, right? I've seen enough of my kids try to drive through mud, right? Not my children, but children I've been around. You get stuck, right? And so as they get stuck, they take all the Israelites come down, and they now have the numbers advantage, not the technology advantage, and they wipe out the Canaanites. And Sisera takes off running, right? And as he takes off running, so God fights that battle, but they haven't captured the leader yet. And as he takes off running, he runs to the tent of this woman named Jael. And I'm not going to read the scripture word for word, but it's this really interesting thing where I'm not sure Jael wasn't a psychopath. Okay, so he runs to this tent, and she's like, "Hey, come in here. I'm on your side." And Sisera runs inside. And remember, God said that the victory, the glory, was going to be a woman's. Well, Jael is this woman, and she brings him inside, and he goes, "Man, I'm really tired." And she goes, "Oh, lay down and sleep." And he goes, "I'm really thirsty." And she gives him some warm milk, right? You get what I'm saying? He goes heavy to sleep. And then she takes a tent peg and drives it through his temple into the ground, right? Like it is a straight, it's like out of Saw, right? I haven't seen that, I'm sorry. It's out Friday the 13th. I like slasher films. And he's pegged to the ground. And then, okay, I do watch Criminal Minds a lot. So this is, she waits for them to come by, and she's like, "Hey, I think I have who you want in here." And they come in, and she just leaves them there, right? But what Brock and Deborah realized that she's not a psycho. She's not a psycho. What has happened? She was God's tool for fighting this fight. And what's really cool is that the things that Jael probably knew how to do was what I said that was the role at that time, that is she knew how to raise kids and take care of the house. Well, they lived in a tent, so I imagine she knew how to drive a tent nail really well. She had to, right? He used exactly what she had, the skills that she had. And what happens? The people of Israel are delivered not on their own fight, but on God's. You know, there's verses in Exodus 14:14 that say things like this: "The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Or 2 Chronicles 20:15 says, "Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed at this great horde, for the battle is not yours, but God's." We're promised over and over and over again that God is for us and not against us, and is fighting battles for us. The problem is, just like the Israelites, we begin to lose focus and begin to just exist in our surroundings. We begin to live with pride and selfishness in our leadership, or we simply just forget to show up to the battle. See, if the Hebrew people don't show up to this battle, they don't win. It's not like he struck them down. He made the circumstances right. And it's, as Deborah starts singing her song in Judges 5, she actually kind of chastises some of the groups that don't, some of the tribes that don't come. She's like, you were still whistling to the flocks. She says, you were still on your ships. Why didn't you show up so God could use you? And as I started thinking about this, family is not always easy. It is not always easy. Leading a family is not always easy. And sometimes I think it feels like we can be alone. I don't know if anybody's ever felt like that. When you're in the midst of struggle, whether that be struggle financially or struggle maybe relationally with your spouse or struggle with something at work, and it just feels like I feel like I'm alone within my family. And sometimes what we just have to remember is we just simply need to set our focus. Are we intentionally following after God with our family, and realize and expect for him to show up? He'll make it rain. It might look different than what we thought. He'll bring the psycho in the tent. No, I'm just joking. He's going to be the one that works. And maybe you're in the spot right now where that's what you're waiting for. And my encouragement to you is just show up. Make a plan with your spouse, with your family. How are we going to continually put God's purpose in front of our family? Are we waking up? Are we going to bed talking about it? Are we waking up talking about it, like it said in Deuteronomy? Are we putting it on our doorpost? Are we intentionally saying, how am I going to serve God this week? How is my family going to serve God this month? How is my family going to serve God this year? Are we leading our families, or are they leading themselves? And as we do that, as we start to lead, we realize God's been there all along, and he's fighting the fight for us. Lord, I just thank you for this day. I just thank you for the way that you fight fights for us.